always a pleasure. Between family and career and various other interests, I get so thin that I often don't get a chance to direct attention as I would like to incidents and occurrences that occur here east of the Mississippi River, or east of the Rocky Mountains for that matter. So it's always a delight for me to have a chance to come here to the east or the south or elsewhere to hear your stories and your experiences and gain further insight and discussion with you. Let me just give you just a little bit of background about where I'm coming from, how I'm approaching the subject. My training is in anatomical sciences with an emphasis in physical anthropology. In other words, I teach human anatomy to health profession students, and then I conduct research as relates to the prehistory of humans, human evolution, and grade 8, particularly grade 8 anatomy and behaviors. And specifically, how we came to be, as a species, poised on 2 legs instead of all 4. And because of that, I mean, I have to admit there was some early influence as a youngster by the Bigfoot subject that I think subliminally led or contributed to ending up in that career. But because of that career, when I was confronted with footprints, with fresh footprints, I think I was in a good position to evaluate those from an academic and scientific perspective. And that's what sort of set the hook for me. And one thing led to another. For the past 10 years now, I've devoted a significant portion of my research program to this question, which dovetails very nicely with the other, well, mainstream or orthodox topics that I deal with. Today, what I'd like to talk to you about, though, is not directly addressing the question of Sasquatch, but indirectly, it is very significant and important, and I think has a significant bearing on questions of origins of Sasquatch, or whatever moniker you'd like to attach. Through interaction with various documentaries, I've had chances to visit places and meet people that I might not have had the opportunity otherwise. And recently, with the History Channel, through Monster Quest, I was able to go to China and look into the question of the Chinese wildman, or Yaren. We haven't heard as much about that subject of late here in the West. There was a significant flap or a flurry of activity in the 70s. Reports coming out of Hubei province were investigated by the government. Government-sponsored expeditions, which had quite a number of participants, both scientific and military, in order to assist. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me jump back here, and we'll get to that. So this picture was actually snapped from a very large mural on the wall of a little cafe that we had lunch in today. And it does represent a rather typical rendering or typical impression of what the wild man looks like, or is perceived to look like in China. It's often described, in this case a wild woman, it's often described with this reddish hair. Often, or sometimes, a much deeper red. One of the eyewitnesses we talked to pointed to the stain on the woodwork in his, on the new edition of his home. And it was a deep rusty brown rather than a carrot red. And he said that was what he had seen. But in other aspects of these wild people, the females often are described as having prominent breasts. And that way it looks very similar to many of the reports we have here in the United States. So, Hubei province is situated in the mountains in sort of west central China, right about in here. It's right up against the mountains. And we initially flew into Beijing, up here to the north, and then flew down to the regional airport here in Hubei. This area, as you can see, being up against the mountains, is very lush and not extensively cultivated, although you'd be amazed at the little farming plots that are hanging precariously on terraced slopes. The topography is very extreme, very steep. The little village, Wiwu, that we were staying in, was on down in the valley on a major tributary to the Yangtze River, the Yellow River. And we then would drive up to some of the sites where the eyewitnesses were seeing things, which were oftentimes as high as 9,000 feet. Lots and lots of relief, and these alternating mountain ranges going up and down and up and down. And so along that altitudinal climb, you would get a very impressive succession of vegetation. Down at the river valley, it was essentially subtropical evergreens. And as we worked our way up, we'd go up into broadleaf deciduous trees, and then as it got colder, there would be mixed coniferous. And finally, up at the top, we'd have Douglas fir. Very large stands of Douglas fir, very similar to the Pacific Northwest in that respect. I mean, there are obviously differences, but there's amazing congruencies between the two sides of the Pacific Ocean. And that'll be significant as we come to it in just a little bit. Another point, too, before we leave this, is that Hubei province also has at least 2 localities that have produced fossils of Gigantopithecus. This is not Gigantopithecus blacki, but it's a slightly earlier species. It's a little bit smaller, but nevertheless, Gigantopithecus did inhabit latitudes this far north at various times in several hundred millennia ago, at least. All right. So our target there in Hubei was a region called the Shenanjia Nature Reserve, and this is Shenon here. He's a deity who is responsible for the productivity of the land, the abundance. And there's this temple to him, this long staircase, and this goes all the way down here past the floor. It's quite a hike to get up to the top, and even right there at the top, we were immediately met by vendors who had all sorts of trinkets and carvings of the wild man and so forth. Here's another rendition, a little less style on it. You can see the horned helmet, almost Viking-looking helmet, and then from Shenon comes the profusion of all the abundance of nature. Shenanjia means Shenon's scaffolding or ladder. And the story goes that there in Hubei, in these very high mountains, Shenon saw some herbs that had particular medicinal properties that he was interested in, but the only way to get to them was to erect a ladder. And so it just denotes the very, very steep and rugged terrain that's found here. You can see if you look at the rainfall chart, it's right up, if you come from this inlet and from this little peninsula where they intersect, that's where Hubei is, and right up here in the mountains. So we're up at, at between 39 and 59 inches of precipitation. So this is a very, very wet environment, very wet forests. So the reason this is significant, and that I was so eager to go and take a look at the evidence that suggests the existence of a large unrecognized primate in China, in the very areas where we know that Gigantopithecus once, well, at least it's recognized to have once tromped, is that it's a very logical hypothesis to suggest that Gigantopithecus is a common ancestor not only for the Chinese yearn, but for the North American Sasquatch, and by way of the Bering Land Ridge. Now, I have to say that when the Bering Land Ridge is mentioned, usually the image that comes to most people's minds who are familiar with that at all is a cold, frozen Arctic wasteland. Maybe with a herd of mammoth trudging into the blizzard and running behind her, a band of primitive men bundled up in their bearskins and waving their spears. And there were times when that was the case, but there were also times, beginning as far back as the Pliocene, during the heyday of the radiation of great apes across Eurasia, when the land ridge was very temperate. And this is based on pollen studies, core studies of looking at fossilized pollen taken from the continental shelf around here, which indicates that there was at times mixed deciduous and coniferous forests that spanned all the way from China into southern British Columbia. And then towards the end of the Pliocene and into the Pleistocene, that climate began to deteriorate a bit, and the forests became much more coniferous in nature. But nevertheless, it's not a matter of, you don't have to envision animals intentionally packing up and with a motivation moving from point A to point B to get to whatever's on the other horizon. This is just a matter of, as that natural habitat expanded from one continent to the other, the native animals moved along through that habitat as well. We have, people are often unaware that from Washington State, fossils of the red panda have been found. Very rare, but fossilized molars of the red panda, this little masked, reddish-looking, almost raccoon-looking animal that was a contemporary of Gigantopithecus in China. So if a little raccoon-sized animal could extend its range from one continent to another, it seems reasonable that an animal like Gigantopithecus, a large terrestrial ape, could also have done the same. So when we arrived in Beijing, I was very gratified that the producers had successfully relocated Dr. Zhou Gujing, who was, or is still, the lead academic researching the Chinese urine. And here we are standing in front of the Beijing Natural History Museum. He's now retired. He's emeritus there at the museum, where he had served for many, many years. And had actually, they tracked him down in western China where he was on vacation. He graciously agreed to participate in our production. He took us down to the museum, some lovely exhibits. This is a Peking man, which is sort of a national fossil of China. They're very proud of the fossil record of Homo erectus in China and the specimens. Here's another version of the Gigantopithecus reconstruction, and alongside a human skull, there's of course the jaw, and this is part of Dr. Kranz's reconstruction of the Gigantopithecus cranium, speculative reconstruction, but nevertheless it conveys a sense of the size. And then in the box here were a handful of isolated teeth of Gigantopithecus. Now let me also use this as a point to reiterate another fact, and that is, people often ask, well, why haven't you found any bones? Why haven't you found any fossils of Bigfoot? Well, we know, or science recognizes the existence of Gigantopithecus, that this species, this giant species, lived there for at least 1 million years. And yet, all we have to show for it are 2 jaws and about 1,000 isolated teeth. And the only reason we have those teeth is because porcupines dragged those remains into the caves where they chewed them up and gnawed away all the soft parts, the roots of the teeth and the thinner parts of the mandible, so leaving just the thickest parts here and the heavy crowns of the teeth. But if it weren't for the action of those porcupines, we'd have no fossils of Gigantopithecus, because they would have deteriorated out in the forests where these animals live, and the soils tend to be rather acidic. Whereas in the caves, which are limestone caves, the buffered alkaline environment in those moist caves then is very conducive to fossilization. But for those millions of years of occupation, we have just specimens from a handful of individuals. So it's not that surprising that fossils have not yet been found. It's frustrating, but it's not that surprising. Dr. Zhou had one cast that at first caught my attention. It was kind of interesting, particularly because it bore a remarkable resemblance, in fact, to the appearance of a rather credible cast from the Walla Walla area here that's pictured in one of the chapters in the book. But upon closer examination, there obviously had been some remodeling taking place. The spaces between the toes were artificially gouged out. Whether that was just to accentuate what the witness thought should be there or not remains to be seen. The track was rather flat. You can see that there's very little contour and relief. But it raises an important point, and sometimes witnesses, and even sometimes investigators, amateur investigators, don't realize that no matter what your intentions are, if you modify the evidence, it undercuts its credibility. It weakens its impact, because then it's not clear where does the modification end and the evidence pick up. This was a footprint here outlined in white, which I realize you can't otherwise see anything. The photograph itself is not that valuable. This is the cast from that footprint, a replica of the cast, and that Dr. Joe had made back in 1970. This was, or in the 70s, not 1970, but in the 70s. This was the track that he was impressed enough with, and on the basis of that and some other evidence, was able to recruit the government-sponsored expedition. It's a little different looking. It has what looks like a divergent toe. He pointed out that he felt that this area back here, from about here to here, is sliding, so that the heel may have come to this point, or even up as short as this point here. And in fact, right here, you can see what it actually looks as if the toes are rather long and perhaps folded under. Now, this raises an interesting question, because Grover Krantz, when he went over to China to do some research, they weren't allowed to go to central China where we did, and so they went to some southern provinces. And down there, through interviewing of eyewitnesses, he became convinced that there was a large terrestrial orangutan species that was yet unrecognized, that was separate and distinct from the stories of the Chinese wild man, although in the minds of the natives, the concept of the wild man encompassed both types. One that was a Sasquatch type, and one that was more like just another unrecognized species of large ground-dwelling orangutan. This foot, it did it. It quit. I told him every time I get one of these, there we go. No. Can I borrow yours? I've not had one of those survive. What it is the gene? The Honobia? Okay. I mean, it looks like the toe is actually folded back, suggesting it's very long. If you've ever seen orangutans walk, they will often, because their toes are so long, they will often fist their foot. And orangs from Borneo and Sumatra, which are very arboreal, have a real twist to their ankle, in fact, bringing the feet in towards the substrate, the support. So when they walk on the ground, they actually walk sometimes on the sides of their fisted feet. And just their heel is sort of pressed down against the ground. But anyway, so this is obviously not what I'm looking for at this stage, as in terms of something to be correlated with what we're finding for Sasquatch. But nevertheless, it is certainly interesting, if indeed it is a footprint. So here's just a couple of pictures of Joe, Professor Joe, right here. This was one of his superiors, and actually he was in the military. But he was, they brought along about 100 soldiers with them to help canvass the mountainsides, looking for evidence, trying to find hair, and so forth. Here's some of them out in the field looking for evidence. This is Dr. Joe right down here. In fact, he showed us the very spot. There's a little rest area, turnout on the road now, where this photograph was taken. I mean, those trees are still there, a little bit bigger. Picture of Joe looking very dapper. They basically, very primitive conditions. He hadn't been back for over 30 years, and so he was extremely impressed by the newfound wealth and the increased standard of living of the people living in this province. When he was there before, I mean, there were very few amenities whatsoever, and the roads weren't paved, and it was rather primitive. And they essentially lived off the land. They would hunt for bushmeat and so forth. Here, this picture is interesting because in their final report, here's a couple of artistic renderings of what they had composited from the many eyewitness accounts of the wild man. And basically upright posture, females with pendulous breasts, low forehead, and peaked skull, deep face, projecting muzzle, and so forth. But because their findings were inconclusive, footprints, hair, eyewitness accounts. The government kind of backed off a little bit, became a little more aloof about the subject. They're still very supportive towards the subject in terms of its potential for tourism. But as far as serious recognition of the existence of the wild man and government recognition, by commission or otherwise, not so eager. And in fact, even Dr. Joe on camera was playing it very cool. And it was only over the course of several days that he sort of warmed back up to his 1970s attitude towards the subject, which was much, much more enthusiastic. At the time, of course, Joe was also the main conduit of flow of information about what was transpiring in the West. So here you can see him discussing during that panel to the commission the evidence for the Sasquatch, including the Patterson-Gilman film here. But I was impressed by the fact that the eyewitnesses and the local people we talked to had no concept of Sasquatch or Bigfoot. In fact, one of the witnesses, which I'll show you in a moment, turned to me and through the interpreter said, "So, do you have anything like the wild man in America?" Well, maybe. As a matter of fact, we might. And so the idea that this is just copycat, as has been suggested to me, just to get attention, to draw, they don't want to be left behind, they're catching up in the space race, they don't want to be left behind in the search for early man, or early whatever, primitive hominoids. So this is a picture of the Shenandoah area. This is typical looking, actually, in the interior of the reserve. There are areas that are even more rugged than this, though, but very, very steep hillsides and deep, deep river gorges. I mean, dropping thousands and thousands of feet, in fact. Just recently, in November of the previous year, 2007, there was a rather publicized event on the Leech, well, not quite there yet, the Leech River. Oh, before I get there, this is, shucks, now I'm going blank on it. It was Mr. Wu. He was a very interesting personality. As soon as I met him, I thought to myself, well, this fellow's either ex-military or ex-police, because he had a very commanding, very authoritative persona, and just his presence was, you could tell the other people around him that were with him clearly held him in a lot of respect and deference. And sure enough, he worked for the secret police. In fact, was a captain at their principal training center. He's now retired. He's extremely interested in this subject and has organized local groups of investigators. And it's really funny because as the government is sort of, in this case the government, as well as the academic community, is sort of pulled back a little more aloof, into that has stepped the novice enthusiasts. And they have the same kinds of quibbles and quarrels and infighting between one another, rivalry between neighboring groups for access to witnesses and so forth. They go out on weekends and camp and look for evidence and follow up on reports. It's just very similar. And unfortunately, they make some of the same mistakes. And I'll point out one of those in just a minute here. This is his assistant, or his right-hand man. This is actually the assistant to Professor Joe from Beijing. And so this is the Leech River. In November of 2007, there was, as I began to say, there was a well-publicized sighting. Tourists, the nature reserve is only just being developed. There's basically a very elaborate entrance and gate, and they're now paving the one principal road, and it has a couple of spur roads that go up and over the passes and back into some of the backcountry. But you're not allowed to drive on those with your own vehicles. You go in, and then you get off and you get into a little bus or something. And there's tourist buses that take you back into the backcountry. And many of these roads just dead end. And there's not a whole lot to get out and do and see, except from the vistas where there's some overlooks and so forth. And then they have a little menagerie of some of the local fauna that you can pull in and look look at, and we'll see that in just a moment. So a tour bus is taking a group down this road, and they're almost to the end. I mean, it dead ends down here, maybe another half a mile, and there's just nothing beyond that for hundreds of miles before you would encounter any type of settlement or spot. Here's the witness. This was one of the tourists. Use it, back button one. Back. And basically what had happened is they came down, and as they rounded this bend, they saw these two reddish-brown figures dart across the road, a very narrow road. You can see, just a one-track road, and dart from the slope side towards the river. And someone yelled, "Yeren, Yeren, Yeren," and they all jumped out of the car, but no one wanted to pursue them down into the undergrowth. But he described them as being, one was about as tall as he was, and one was about up to his chin, he said, and so apparently they were upright and running across the road, covered reddish brown hair. Here's one of the assistants. They were very intrigued with my poncho. I guess ponchos weren't popular over there. But I mean, of course, as soon as we got the camera equipment out, they clouded over and began just downpour. So I've got my raincoat and a poncho on. My raincoat was already almost soaked through. It was just such a torrent, but it was fun to interact with. I mean, they were very friendly, very eager to have us, and delighted to have us there, and very happy to share. So Mr. Wu had investigated this incident and had quite a lengthy report typed up, and he gave us copies of that. I haven't got the transcript of the translation yet. But he also cast two footprints. And here you can see a little different angle, not a whole lot of detail. And of course, they always put me on the spot. They will never let me look at the cast before the camera's running. It has to be on camera, me unveiling them so they get my initial reaction. So when you watch these documentaries and you see me choosing my words very carefully, it's because, I don't want to blurt something as first impression out and then think, well, no, wait a minute, let's look at this. So I'm trying to very quickly assess what I'm seeing. And, I'm missing that. Would you go back one? I thought I had guess I don't. I'll have to point it out. If you look, though, up here you can see toes. 1, 2, 3, 4. There's just a faint part of a fifth over here. And then this foot comes down, and actually there's a pad that comes across like that, and then there's this boulder right here. So if you're familiar with bears, and particularly with the bears in that area, they have a large ulnar pad, which is right here at the base of the palm on the forepaw. So we've got 5 toes and a sort of a bean-shaped forepaw with that extra pad. And then back here, tapering down, right here you can see there's a lot of overflow plaster, but right along here is the outline. There's a toe right there, toes across here. There's the hind foot, so it's the forefoot and hind foot of a bear. And then over here, here's a larger bear. You can see that it's turned on its side a little bit if I swung it around. But over here is, right there, is the forepad, and then back here is the ulnar pad. The toes didn't show up. So this is clearly a bear. Now, so the question remains, did the witnesses see a bear? Or did they see two Sasquatch or two Yeren that ran across the road, and then the investigator found bear tracks in the same spot? Well, that could happen. It could happen. As you'll see if you watch the next Monster Quest, one of the next Monster Quest episodes, we went back up to Snowgrove Lake, where we had stones thrown at us. And there was kind of a remarkably similar sort of a situation where two witnesses are absolutely convinced they saw a tall, upright, arm-swinging, hairy Sasquatch. And yet, then when someone went back and cast what they thought were footprints associated with it, it turns out they were composite bear tracks. But in this case, in the case up in Canada, in Ontario, the witnesses, I was very confident in their testimony. And there were bear tracks all over the place. We went back up, and on the day we went up, we found about 1.5 miles from the site tracks of the same sow-cut bear. And we were able to match those up to the elements of this composite footprint very, very confidently. That could be the case here, but we don't know. But there's a clear misidentification. Fortunately, I didn't have to tell Mr. Wu that assessment the producers did after I left. Then we were introduced to Mr. Yuan, right here on the left, standing beside Mr. Zhou. Mr. Yuan was a really interesting character as well. For a Chinese gentleman, he was quite tall, 1 meter 85. You know, he had to snap that off to us immediately. 1 meter 85, and he would shake hands with us, and he'd pull us up behind him just to measure off how tall he was. Well, he was chagrined because everybody in the camera crew was 6 foot plus, and our cameraman was like 6'3", and I was the shortest of the group. And so he thought, because when he'd walk up and down in the village, as you can see, and Professor Zhou's actually a bit tall. The villagers were tended to be shorter, so he was at least not head and shoulders taller than most people in the village, and commanded a lot of respect for that fact. So anyway, but he was very, very friendly. It turns out he was one of the military enlisted men back in the 1970s that was on the expedition with Professor Zhou. So this was a 30-some-odd year reunion between the two of them, and it was a very happy reunion for them. Mr. Yuan took us up first to meet this witness, and this was an interesting story. This is just a very humble farmer. This is a gentleman who had just stained his woodwork. He had just added on next to their little hovel of a cinder block house. They had just built a very nice addition, I mean, by their standards, their methods of construction. It was a very nice habitation. And he just had a little small farming area, and as is typical, they would often supplement their larder by hunting. He was up hunting one time and suddenly came upon 2 deer, stared stiff, dropped down into the bushes, because by their reckoning, if you run into a Yeren, you're due to be eaten. And so he's sitting there just thinking, no, this is it, I'm going to be eaten, you know. He coughed and tried to make some noises just to get their attention. And when he did, one looked over at him, and he was all the more scared. This is it. And he said he literally sat there for about 10 minutes, just quaking in his shoes. And then he worked up the courage and he thought, well, if I'm going to be eaten, I'm going to, by gosh, see what's going to eat me. So he stood up and turned around and looked at them. At that point, they both stood up and walked away in the opposite direction. He hustled home very quickly. But we actually, no, I hope I don't zap something in the eye. I put together a little identikit of sorts. And it started off with things like bear in various postures, standing upright or down on all fours, front, back views. And then it went to other common primates that he might see in that area, like, well, rare primates actually, like the golden monkey. We'll see some examples of that later. And then I went to monkeys in various postures again, some standing upright, and then went to some great apes, and then had some anthropological reconstructions of early man, various species of early man, and then some of the published pictures of Sasquatch, impressions of Sasquatch. And what he settled on, when he opened up and saw pictures of bear, he just kind of looked at me like, you know, what are you thinking? And he flips past those pages. And then he came to this one and he stopped and he points to the hair color. He says, yes, the hair color. And he said that the face, the mouth is different and the legs are longer. And then he came to this picture, and at this point, Mr. Yuan has kind of come over and he's watching over our shoulder. And he agreed. He said, yes, this is what it looked like. He said, this color, but it looked like this. So that was interesting. And it's obviously, here's an orang, so they're not seeing large terrestrial orangs, they're seeing something that's very different, but that has this color much more frequently reported. So, well, I lost my train of thought here, sorry. Well, this is here because recently I named the footprints attributed to Sasquatch according to the conventions of ichnotaxonomy. Now, ichnotaxonomy is a field that where the primarily paleontologists study fossilized traces and footprints of extinct animals, particularly those for whom the track maker is not known or recognized. It had been suggested by one ichnotaxonomist, and we discussed it at some great length, about the possibility of naming the Sasquatch tracks. In fact, Dr. Krantz had at one time unofficially suggested that based on the tracks we could name it, and he had suggested the name Gigantopithecus canadensis. The problem was you can't do that. You can't, and you cannot refer the footprints to a known animal. And in this case, in a book that was published by Martin Lockley, who is one of the most foremost experts on dinosaur trackways around the world, he was intrigued by Grover's suggestion, and he's very interested in the subject of Sasquatch, but he pointed out the flaws in Grover's logic, and he said, now if Grover had done such and such, then that might have borne up under scientific scrutiny. So I became acquainted with Martin. Martin finally, we got together, he came over and spent a day in the lab, looked at all the footprints, we exchanged a bunch of casts, early hominids and Sasquatch and back and forth. And he said, yeah, go for it. And so I wrote up a paper, submitted an abstract for a symposium that we held down at the New Mexico Museum of Natural History. A symposium on Cenozoic tracks and traces. And this abstract was peer-reviewed, as was the manuscript before it was published, by 5, usually they have 2 or 3, had 5 reviewers who were all well-recognized, established authorities in the field of taxonomy, and presented this to a body of about 50 people, with only, as I was telling someone earlier, only one curmudgeon in the group. And after his questions, it became obvious he didn't know what he was talking about. Everyone kind of hissed him. And at one point, he made a comment about one of the footprints that I had interpreted. He said, it doesn't look like that to me at all. What does that say to you? And I said, well, that says that you don't understand the function of hominid feet very well. And everyone in the audience clapped, and so we shut up after that. But the name that we've applied is Anthropoidopes ameriborealis, which roughly translates to North American 8-foot. And the type specimens are the right and left cast by Roger Patterson at the film site. And we don't have those originals accessioned in a museum. The duplicates of them are at the Smithsonian. And this was another reason for selecting this incident, because molds and duplicate casts are in the Department of Anthropology at the Smithsonian, and the originals that were cast by Bob Titmus are accessioned at the China Flats Willow Creek Museum in Northern California, which is a marginal museum, but nevertheless they're in a public museum that is accessible to other researchers if they want to compare. Here are the 10 tracks that were cast by Bob Titmus about 10 days after the films were shot. These are actually stills of scans of footprints themselves, the originals. We took a portable 3D scanner down to the museum in Willow Creek and scanned these along with all the other original material that they have in their collection. And that, my summer got set back because of some personal health issues. And so everything is several months behind for me at the moment. But our intent is that this database with these 3-dimensional scans will be accessible online to the public. And it's particularly serious researchers. You'll be able to take a decimated file, a lower resolution file, drop it into a 3D viewer, and rotate it in 3-dimensional space and examine it. You can take the light source and move it around and bring out the highlights and so forth. You can take measurements on it and all sorts of things. And I'll show some examples of that tomorrow. But I want to draw your attention particularly to this track down here, which there's a duplicate of on the table in the back, which shows a very pronounced pressure ridge. And I'll come back to that in just a moment. Here are some high-resolution stills of that, so you can see that. This is a significant track, and for those of you that aren't familiar with my concept of the foot anatomy of the Sasquatch. Tomorrow we'll go into it in probably more depth than you care to hear, but you'll be diligent students, I hope, and pay close attention, because it's very significant. Most people, when they'd seen photos of this footprint, had assumed that there was a branch in the sand this thing walked over. But I drew attention to the fact that it wasn't. It's a pressure ridge that results from flexibility of the midfoot, where the heel has come up. Pressure is now concentrated over this part of the foot, which pushes up the substrate behind that flexible joint right here. So, by contrast, the hallmark of the human foot is a longitudinal arch with a well-developed, differentiated ball with particularly elaborated soft tissue here underneath that joint, and very short toes. And that stiff joint then, as these joints lock into a fixed position, it allows the foot to act as a more efficient lever, and has actually permitted us to shorten the lever arm back here in the calcaneal tuberosum, which translates into a speed lever. So in other words, for a little bit of translation movement back here, a lot of movement is experienced out here. These are adaptations for running. We see these same things to a much greater extent in running animals that are digitigrade, like cats and dogs and horses and deer and so forth. Sasquatch, on the other hand, appears to retain a flexible midfoot that allows the front part of the foot to act somewhat independently from the back. Because the lever arm is only down here to the star, with its greater weight, the heel is noticeably elongated. We'll talk about, tomorrow we'll talk more about what that means, but it explains the very thick ankles that are often witnessed by, or mentioned by witnesses. It explains the protruding heel that's been pointed out in the Patterson-Gimlin film, that has been suggested to be an artificial, evidence of an artificial foot applied to the underside of the foot, whatever. Here you can actually see it, see this action. If you watch back here on the trailing foot, you can see that at the first initial part of the step of the translation of the center of gravity forward, first the heel comes out. It's not the entire foot levering up, pivoting at the ball, but back here. And then also notice out here, you can see very clearly as that foot swings forward, notice the toes point to the sky, or dorsiflex. These are long toes. Now when you look at the bottom of the foot, this was what misled some of the earlier researchers. If you look at the bottom of the foot of Patty, her toes are very short, appear to be very short and stubby. The sole pad extends way up under the toes, is what's really going on. And so when the toes actually flex, there sometimes is a flexion crease, just like you have a flexion crease across the palm, which resides right underneath your knuckles. So our palm goes up beyond the point of flexion of your knuckles, so when you bend your hand, a crease shows up. Okay? Because of that impression of stubby toes from the plantar surface, people like Rene de Hinden, for example, would look at tracks from the Blue Mountains outside of Walla Walla, which had a shorter sole pad and longer toes, and he'd call them sausage toes, so they would fade. They didn't look like real Sasquatch tracks. But in reality, Patty has very long toes. You see here. Okay, now kind of with that setting, and the significance of the Patterson-Gimlin film site tracks and that pressure ridge, then Mr. Yuan was scheduled to bring out some tracks that he had found. He laid claim to a site. When he was hiking up one ridge, he looked across about a quarter mile across the valley, that he saw on the hillside a reddish-brown looking figure lying on top of a rock, sunning itself. At first he didn't know if it was a bear or what, so he shouts at it from across where he's at. And it sat up and looked across at him, figured he was far enough away to not be a problem, and laid back down. He yelled again. This time it looked at him and decided, well, maybe I need to move him. Slid off the rock and walked away on two legs into the trees. He later, at a water hole, found these tracks. This was a little, fortunately, exposure is not great because of that background. But you can see there are clearly 5 toes, And at first glance, if you look, you might think, well, this just looks like another set of bear tracks, like you were describing before. But in reality, and this is why you can't always rely on photographs. You've got to see the tracks themselves, the prints or the casts. There is a very nice rounded heel here, not a concavity by any means. Rounded heel, and it is continuous. There are 5-foot toes with an arrangement that's more hominoid rather than ursine. You can see, looking on the side, it's not a superimposition of 2 tracks, but there is a distinct pressure ridge. Very continuous, nice rounded heel. And here you can see the toes. Another view of the toes. And here it is, one of them, compared to the titmus cast that's on display back there from the Patterson-Gilman film site. The orientation and position, the pressure ridge is identical. The relative length and shape, in fact, even down into proportion. I mean, it's remarkable. These could be sisters. They're so similar to one another. Now, if you've seen the documentary, they just kind of ran through this, and they didn't give it the punch that I was hoping they'd give it, because this was amazing. These tracks, when we were on our way to the interview site, he had the tracks in the suitcase, and of course they wouldn't let me look at them until they had the camera roll. But I had handed him a paper, which was the description of the ichnotaxon, and it was richly illustrated with figures of these various 3D scans. And in fact, I can't flip back to it, but I wonder if I can. No. Well, don't go back. It's back by the way. Oh, okay. I won't bother. But there was a picture that had the 3 views of this cast in 3 perspectives. He suddenly reaches up. We were on right in a little tour bus kind of thing, charter bus, and he reaches up and he grabs my arm, and he can't speak English, and he can't read the paper, but he's obviously studying the figures very closely. He thumps his finger on that figure and looks at me like, no, this is it. I said, okay, well, we'll see. And sure enough, unveils these and unwraps them, and boom, here they are. I mean, the implication of the congruence between these 2 independent examples. Very credible witness. After he got out of the military, he became a game warden. He worked for the government in that nature reserve. Now he's in semi-retirement, upstanding citizen in the community and respected by the villagers and so forth. Really suggests a common origin. And that common origin, the sensible origin, is the presence of Gigantopithecus in the area. This is just a shot. I'm probably not going to get the full benefit of it, it's not as dark. But this is way up, we're at about just under 10,000 feet elevation. And you could be in the Rocky Mountains. It looks just like it. There's meadows with sedges and wild onions. See me eat a wild onion. Yeah, they make a big deal of it. Someone even emailed me and said, are you suggesting that a population of the wild man is going to survive on wild onions? I said, no, watch it more carefully. I said, this is one food item that is obviously plentiful here, but I never suggested that's all they're eating. But of course, they have to have an example for the cameras. One of the challenges of doing that kind of work is you don't have ultimate control over what's presented and how you're presented. But boy, the folks that were with us, we went up and we camped at a spot here in this meadow, and there was a water hole, a very prominent water hole just around the bend here, and a big mud flat and lots of animal sign. And so Mr. Yuan was portrayed taking us into the reserve. We had permission to spend 1 night, but we had to have a police escort. And then again, if you see the documentary, we ran into a snag because one of the locals involved in one of the groups, who was an amateur photographer, felt that he should be taking all the pictures and documenting our trip. And when the producers didn't bite, then he got on the phone and reported that these Westerners are trying to get into the park and they need to stop. And so the park rangers wouldn't let us in. And so it took about 45 minutes of telephone calls back and forth until we finally got permission again, even though we had the papers in our hand from the central office down in the village to get in. And then we had police going with us. They were great. They were a lot of fun. I got to share one funny story just to lighten you up here. You're looking way too serious for tonight. Well, here, let me, well, a couple funny stories. Here's Adam Davies. If you have it, or Adam Davis, excuse me. It looks like Davies, but it's pronounced Davis. Has an E in there. Adam is sort of a self-made adventurer. He works in computer technology and so forth, but he saves up his English pounds and then goes off on these expeditions. And he had actually suggested this subject to Doug Hychek at What Entertainment for Monster Quest, and so they invited me to come along. Great bloke to get along with. But when we went camping, he's pretty good size too. He's about 6'1", not my size as well. I'm a little bit short. I herniated some discs in my back, and I actually lost an 1.5 inches. I asked, should we bring our own camping equipment? And they said, no, our local arrangements are being made, and Mr. Wu is going to bring a tent for us. So we get up there, and it's this little bivvy tent. It's tiny, and barely enough room for 2 Chinese, let alone 2 Americans. So unfortunately, we weren't spending much time in there together. But it was very cold at that elevation, so we were bundled up in our sleeping bags and so forth. But in the middle of the night, at one point, I'm rolling around, and I roll over, and I'm laying here, and I open my eyes, and his face is literally about 1 inch from me. So I roll over the other way, and then about 20 minutes later, I hear this, "Jeff, roll over, you're squashing me." And I said, I'm already on the side of the tent. The seam between the wall and the floor was underneath me, not to the side of it. The tent was kind of bending over this way. But we had a great time. There's the obligatory sunset. But then on the way down, and I'll come back to the funny story in just a moment. On the way down, this is that little menagerie, and this is the golden monkey, or the snub-nosed macaque. And this little beauty had been born about 3 months earlier, a little girl, a little female monkey, and she was so tiny that she could slide right through the bars. And the keepers gave up trying to restrain her, so she just had free reign of the whole compound. She'd just wander around, and then she'd go back in. And so when we would come to visit, and we went back a second time, it was just so much fun. She'd come right out and come right up to us, and they usually wouldn't let visitors feed her, but since we were VIPs, they made an exception. So she'd come right up and climb on your shoulder. The one of our media liaison from Shanghai, her name was Lisa. She, this little monkey just ran right up her back and was laying on her shoulder, and she would just turn over and roll on her back like this, and then she started grooming her and picking through her hair. It was really fun, but just amazing. But if you wouldn't mind backing up one, I jumped ahead one too soon. They're very large monkeys. You can see the male here. There's there it is again. I'm doing what you did there with the pointer. This is the male and the female, and they do form couples. And this is a great little family shot. But if he stood up, he would stand, about 4.5 feet tall. And there have been hair that has been collected, which has been attributed to the hair that has turned out to be golden monkey. And given their color, you can see how someone might confuse the two. So it's always something to bear in mind. But just darling. There's Adam lugging for the camera. So on our final night, so here's the final funny joke that of course doesn't make it into the documentary, but you can laugh when you watch it. Mr. Yuan, of course, had to invite us to his house to eat. This was quite an honor for him. At first, we didn't think we were going to have time, and the director tried to back out, and that was a mistake, because this was a matter of honor now. And they spent, for what was for them, an exorbitant amount of money to put on a great spread for us with all of these foods that by now we were very tired of eating after 5 days of eating the same kinds of things. But, and at this point, there was lots of drinking going on. It's very traditional with new friends to exchange tobacco and exchange alcohol. And so there was the round of drinks going around. And in addition to beers, there were also these, the equivalent of a Russian vodka. And I don't remember what it was called, with these little clear flasks. But these policemen were drinking them for breakfast on a camping trip. I don't recommend that for anybody. And I'm a teetotaler, so I'm passing all this and trying to be very diplomatic. But once the initial round of toasts has been made, then the one-on-one challenges start. And so you pick somebody out across from the table, and we have a big lazy Susan that spins around, big glass turntable, and we're all seated around this. But you'll pick out somebody across the table, and they stand up, and whether it's a beer or whether it's the vodka, you toast, but then you have to down, you have to empty the bottle. And so the night was getting very interesting, but one of the policemen that was with us, I guess, had bonded with me, and so I could see he was sidling me out for a toast, and so I didn't want him to be embarrassed, and so I grabbed the interpreter, our fixer, and I said, Maggie, remind him I don't drink. And I had been sitting here eating the toaster going on. I had a Chinese pear, and I was working on that, just a piece of fruit. So I pretty much finished that, and that was set aside. Before she could say anything, he jumps up, runs off to the kitchen, and he comes back with a peeled apple. And hands me the apple, and then he stands up, and I said, well, I usually stop after one, but... So we clicked apple and vodka, and then I had to hurry and try to eat the whole apple before he finished his life. So it was really a great time. So this is our director. I should have gone through this. I thought I had this all down. Jared Christie, and Aaron, and Adam. Adam has already had a few. This is Mr. Luan here. And then one of the nice things that happened, though, was that Mr. Wu had, at first, when he heard that Professor Joe was coming, I guess because Professor Joe had become a little aloof and wasn't giving the support of the academic community, and so he was considered by the amateur enthusiasts to be, written off. And when he heard that Professor Joe was coming, he wasn't going to participate. And the directors kind of pulled him aside and said, well, no, why are we doing this? We all want to arrive at the same place, an understanding of this phenomenon. So let's just bury the hatchet and let's get along. Let's just all get along, okay? And so he agreed. And by the end of the trip, they were tipping him back, and they were arms around each other, and they were fast friends. And there were lots of promises of collaboration and interaction. And so that was really delightful too, that happened. So here we are at the end. Professor Joe also said, and this hasn't materialized yet, but he revealed to me that there were quite a number of his colleagues in the forestry ministry that were actually very interested in this subject, despite the government kind of aloofness, and that they were especially interested to learn what was taking place in the United States and Canada. And so we could expect some exchanges to begin to occur. So a real bridge across the Pacific was established. And I think that's it. So we're happy to take any questions you might have. Yes?
Now I know I've seen a people where you had examined a Yeti cast too, and you found it comparable when the casts.
Yeah. Well, this was interesting, and that's a whole other presentation. But we did a very thorough review of the footprint evidence for the Yeti. A student of mine was she was interested in forensic anthropology, and so she came and wanted to do an independent problems course with me on footprints. And so I thought, one thing I've always wanted to do is to do a thorough, systematic assessment of all the tracks we could get our hands on. So we really dug, and all the ones that were readily available from published sources, and then we started tracking down unpublished sources. We found quite a few. Well, found several. There's only a couple dozen total. And of those couple dozen, a good 2/3 of them were bear. Absolutely, unquestionably bear. Which raises some interesting questions as to the native perception. Are they just lumping these two entities into one because they're kind of man-like? Bear often are very anthropomorphic, and if you've skinned out a bear, the musculoskeletal system is remarkably similar. There have been times when bear appendages have been attributed to Sasquatch, which you may have seen in the press, the infamous pickled hand of unknown origin. Yeah. So of all of the tract, and then another significant fraction are unintelligible, either through sublimation and melting, refreezing, or just obscure and ambiguous. And we're left with essentially two. I figure these in the introductory chapter in my book, and those are the Shipton photo, which still remains rather enigmatic, although I can't understand why he didn't. He took two pictures, but he should have taken two different footprints, not two of the same track. And the McNeely-Cronin expedition, which looks, for all intents and purposes, no pathology, as might be the case with the Shipton footprint, but looks, for all intents and purposes, like a chimpanzee stepping in the snow. But then along comes Jason with this cast from Bhutan, or was it Nepal? No, it was Nepal. It wasn't Bhutan.